All right, let's pull the file. Tonight, we're cracking open a very old, very cold case. It's a legend that haunts the deepest, darkest winter nights, a story of a ghostly army riding the storm. But this is way more than just a ghost story. This is a cosmic investigation. We're on the trail of the Wild Hunt.
I want you to picture this. It's late. The wind is just howling outside, and the world is completely dark and frozen over. And then you hear a sound. A sound that is definitely not just the storm. It's a roar of howls, the thunder of 1,000 galloping hooves, the blast of a great horn splitting the sky. What is that? What in the world rides on that winter storm? That's the question at the very heart of this case file.
Okay, let's dive into Act 1, the legend itself. First, we have to get the basic story down, because this wasn't some random haunting. Oh no, this was an organized event, a spectral procession led by a god. And if you saw it, well, it was always an omen of something terrible about to happen.
So let's get a clear definition on the books. The Wild Hunt is a furious, terrifying chase across the night sky, and it happens specifically in winter. And leading this whole parade of horrors, none other than the All-Father himself, Odin, often described as this one-eyed man in a dark, shadowed cloak. And the really crucial part here is that seeing the hunt was never, ever good news. It was like a prophecy written in the clouds, warning you that war, or plague, or some other major disaster was right around the corner. Now for Act 2, because this chase, it wasn't random at all. This was a targeted operation. The Wild Hunt was basically a form of cosmic judgment, a calculated search for some very specific souls. Odin wasn't just out for a joyride. He was hunting, and he had a very clear purpose. And this is where it gets really fascinating. The hunt was a mechanism for moral enforcement. Think of it like a supernatural version of social justice almost. It was a way for a community's values, its rules, and its fears to be acted out on a huge cosmic stage. It was a public declaration, literally written across the sky, of what society considered dishonorable or just plain unacceptable. It wasn't just about punishment, it was about reminding everyone what the rules were.
So who exactly was on Odin's list? The Corey profile is incredible. First up, you've got the dishonored dead. We're talking traitors, cowards, anyone who failed their people. Then, the hunt would go after the living who had committed some kind of terrible sin. It also swept up restless spirits, the ones who just refused to move on. But here's where it gets more complicated. The hunt also collected victims of violence, people who were murdered or who died by suicide, and the socially excluded, like women who tragically died in childbirth and were often denied the usual proper burial rites. It was this haunting collection of souls, all caught somewhere between the worlds.
So, you've got your hunter, and you've got your hunted. Now for Act 3, the arrival. This was not a quiet entrance. The coming of the Wild Hunt was this massive atmospheric event, a terrifying spectacle announced by the elements themselves.
The first sign was always the sky. Even on a perfectly clear winter night, these dark, ominous storm clouds would just appear out of nowhere. It was a sudden, unnatural darkness, a sign that the wall between our world and the next was getting thin, and the All-Father was getting ready to ride.
And then you'd hear it, a low rumble that wasn't quite thunder. No, it was deeper, more rhythmic. The old tales describe it as thunder that rolls like pounding hooves, a sound that just builds and builds until it feels like the sky itself is about to crack open. This wasn't a storm of rain, it was a storm of spirits.
And here we see the source of that sound. Those pounding hooves belonged to Sleipnir, Odin's mythical eight-legged horse. Now, a horse with 8 legs, it moves at an impossible speed. It can gallop not just across the land, but right across the sky itself. The thunderous charge of Sleipnir was the final, unmistakable signal that the hunt was no longer on its way. It was here.
Which brings us right to the climax in Act 4, the chase and its witnesses. We've set the stage, the leader is here. So now, let's break down the tactical elements of this hunt and the horrifying fate of anyone unlucky enough to actually see it.
Okay, let's look at the tactical breakdown. Odin didn't ride alone. He had a whole crew. His famous ravens, Hugin and Munin, that's thought and memory, they were his scouts. They'd fly ahead of the whole procession, find the targeted souls, and basically mark them for the chase. Then came the wolves, massive, terrifying wolves, adding this primal fear to the chase. And right at the center of it all was Odin, the All-Father, leading this chaotic army of the dead as they thundered across the sky.
Which, of course, brings us to the most important question for any person on the ground. What happens if you witness the hunt? What if you're the one who looks up and sees this spectral army charging through the clouds? What happens to you?
The answer was pretty grim. The folk wisdom was crystal clear and desperate. Do not look. If you heard the roar of the hunt getting closer, the only thing to do was to immediately throw yourself face down on the ground and not look up until it was over. Because to witness the hunt was to risk being swept up into it, your soul literally stolen, and forced to join that endless, terrifying chase across the winter sky for all time.
So far, we've been treating this like a real event, a supernatural case file. But for Act 5, we're going to shift our investigation. What was the real purpose of this myth? What does it tell us about the people who believed in it so strongly? Let's analyze how this story was actually used to explain chaos and tragedy.
This right here really gets to the heart of why this myth was so important. Think about a tragedy, like a sudden, violent death. The hunt gave it a narrative structure. It wasn't just a random, meaningless event. That person was taken by the hunt for a reason. For those who were socially excluded, like the women we mentioned who died in childbirth, the hunt gave them a kind of mythological home. They weren't just lost souls, they were riding with a god. And for the general chaos of life, the hunt was a prophetic warning, a way to make sense of hard times to come.
Ultimately, the Wild Hunt gave a face to a deep, ancient fear, the return of the harmful dead. I mean, the idea of restless spirits, of ghosts with unfinished business, that's a universal fear. This myth took that vague, abstract terror and gave it a name, a leader, and a purpose. It organized the chaos of the supernatural world into something you could understand, fear, and, most importantly, try to avoid.
And that brings us to our final act, the conclusion of this long, cold case file, the myth's lingering shadow. Why do we still talk about this story? What is its ultimate legacy? Here's the core takeaway, the bottom line. The Wild Hunt was so much more than a scary story you tell around a fire. It was a mirror. It took a community's collective shadow, all of its anxieties about death, honor, sin, and social order, and it projected it onto the winter sky for everyone to see. It was an incredibly powerful way to reinforce what it meant to be a good person and a terrifying warning of the spiritual consequences if you failed.
And this leaves us with one final, and I think pretty provocative question. The Wild Hunt gave a story, a narrative, to the chaos of the ancient world. It gave answers for things that felt unexplainable. So I'll leave you with this to think about. What myths are we creating right now to explain our chaos today? Case closed.